This week on The Inside Story, former President Donald Trump convicted on all counts. 34 guilty verdicts in his hush money trial in New York. We'll take a look at what the verdict might mean for an election just 6 months away. Joe Biden's son also heads to federal court on weapons charges. Plus, a new plan to end the war in Gaza, the latest on the war in Ukraine, and Mexico holds an historic election. Now, on The Inside Story, U.S. justice and global conflicts.
Hi, and welcome to The Inside Story. I'm VOA Press Freedom Editor Jessica Dorit. This week, we look at those historic guilty verdicts in the trial of former President Donald Trump and another legal case involving sitting President Joe Biden's son, Hunter. It's a big show this week, so let's get right into that Trump conviction at the New York City courthouse. VOA's Tina Trin has more from Manhattan.
Guilty on all 34 counts. That's what a unanimous New York jury decided after less than 2 days of deliberation, that Donald Trump, the first U.S. president tried in a criminal court, falsified business records to suppress potentially damaging information ahead of his 2016 election. After hearing the verdict, the presumed 2024 Republican presidential candidate left the courthouse, saying voters will decide his fate on Election Day.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
President Joe Biden's re-election campaign released a statement saying, "In New York today, we saw that no one is above the law." Former federal prosecutor and New York Law School professor Steve Cohen was not surprised by the verdict.
The legal reality is either you believe in the jury system or you don't. And I happen to believe in the jury system. The case was tried. It was tried carefully, at times almost meticulously. It doesn't mean there won't be issues on appeal. There always are issues on appeal. It doesn't mean that there won't be surprises to come.
22 witnesses testified in the 6-week trial, including a tabloid newspaper editor who described suppressing stories critical of Trump. Adult film star Stormy Daniels, who said she was paid to keep quiet about a sexual encounter with Trump that he denies. And former Trump attorney Michael Cohen, who said he made those payments to Daniels on Trump's behalf. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said the jury made its decision based on the evidence in the law.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
Trump's sentencing is scheduled for July 11th, just days before the Republican Party is expected to formally nominate him as its presidential candidate at a party convention in the Midwestern state of Wisconsin. Tina Trin, VOA News, New York.
Days after the jury returned that verdict, Mr. Trump returned to the campaign trail. He's the first convicted felon to run for US president as a major party candidate. Scott Stearns looks at how voters are reacting on the campaign trail.
Donald Trump supporters continued to cheer their candidate outside New York's Trump Tower, a day after the former president was convicted of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in a scheme to illegally influence the results of his 2016 election. In the city's Chelsea neighborhood, voter Nicholas Warner says the conviction was horrible and the country needs a second Trump term.
When he was in office for 4 years, we had nothing like we have going on now with the war and everything else, or the economy and inflation. So I just would like him to come back so we can just take care of business like a businessman and get this country where it's got to go.
In Maryland, voter Arkady Lapidus says Trump's claim that his trial was rigged is not good for the Republican Party or for the country.
There is nothing until this party dumps Donald Trump, says we believe in elections, we believe in the courts, we believe in juries who hand down verdicts because they're our fellow Americans. Until the party wholesale espouses American values as I see them, I will never vote Republican again.
Voter Margaret Barnes says that even with a felony conviction, Trump is more believable than Joe Biden.
Biden just strikes me as being fake, and he's just fake sentimentality, just telling stories as if he's this nice old man when, you know, it's just artificial. I don't believe him. It's insincere. And with Trump, he's bombastic, and he's, you know, in that world of gold toilets and champagne and caviar and golf courses and Saudi princes. But even though what he says can be offensive, I believe him a lot more.
In Colorado, voter Luda Golodnik says Trump's conviction is deserved, and she hopes it hurts his campaign.
The way that he speaks about women, the way that he treats other countries, the way that he talks about illegal immigrants, him being married to an immigrant also, it just, it's like, yeah, I think he needs to. He's had what he's had coming a long way.
In Nevada, voter Keith Dayton says the verdict has no impact on his vote.
I'm still voting for Donald Trump. I think this whole thing has been a mockery. I'm embarrassed for our country. I wouldn't have him over for a beer or go to the pub with him. But that's not what it's about.
In the electoral swing state of Pennsylvania, the verdict may boost Trump supporters, says voter Jeffrey Nesbitt.
I think it would be much more effective for the American people to just beat him and his movement at the polls. I think that there's a good possibility that this verdict may motivate his movement to come out and vote even more aggressively and act more aggressively in this upcoming election.
90% of registered Republicans still back Trump, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll. That remaining 10% of Republicans, now less likely to vote for Trump, could make a difference in a close election where both candidates need to hold their bases and win independent voters. Scott Stearns, VOA News.
It's been a challenging few weeks for the American legal system, with charges from both sides that the justice system is being used to settle political disagreements. In another closely watched case, the trial of the president's son, Hunter Biden, is taking place in the state of Delaware. The younger Biden faces 3 felony charges of lying to a gun dealer, lying about drug use at the time of purchase, and then illegally keeping the gun after sale. Hunter Biden pleaded not guilty and says he's being unfairly targeted by the Justice Department, echoing the similar complaints as Mr. Trump. Charges of politically motivated courtrooms have made their way to the top court in the US. Congressional Democrats called on the US Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito to recuse himself from 2 cases related to the 2020 election. The calls came after reports that flags associated with the same people who stormed the Capitol on January 6 were seen displayed at Alito's properties. As VOA's congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson reports, public concern over judicial standards is growing.
New concerns this week over ethical standards for the nation's highest court.
The problem that we confront is that the Supreme Court has chosen to conduct itself as if the judiciary is above the law.
Justice Samuel Alito has denied Senate Democrats' requests to step away from judging 2 cases relating to the January 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol. Democrats are concerned after a New York Times report that flags associated with the rioters were displayed on Alito's properties. Alito, responding in a letter, says that was his wife's decision and she has a right to exercise her own right to free speech. Last year, Senate Democrats pushed for new ethical reforms when it was alleged that conservative Justice Clarence Thomas's wife was active in efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
The problem of ethics and disclosure in the Supreme Court can be cured before the end of the day by one person, Chief Justice Roberts.
Experts in judicial ethics told lawmakers conflicts of interest were a problem in judges across the ideological spectrum.
While we cannot dismiss Justice Thomas's egregious ethical problems, it is also true that former Justices Ginsburg, Breyer, and others have heard cases where they likely should have recused.
The Supreme Court often hears requests from lower U.S. courts for judges with conflicts of interest to step aside.
The Supreme Court, there's no higher court. There's no court to which a party's rejected recusal petition could be taken. And the court has yet to set up any kind of internal mechanism to deal with that.
Durbin and other Senate Democrats have called for an enforceable code of conduct for Supreme Court justices for more than a decade. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
Let's turn our attention to global conflicts. In the Israel-Hamas war, another ceasefire proposal nearly 8 months after Hamas launched its October 7 surprise attack. Hamas on Tuesday said the group could not agree to a deal that does not secure a clear Israeli position on a permanent ceasefire and a complete withdrawal from Gaza. And Israeli leaders, they've pledged to continue military operations until Hamas is destroyed, despite a ceasefire proposal announced by President Joe Biden just days earlier. VOA White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has more.
As Israel continues its military campaign in Gaza, efforts towards securing a ceasefire face a stumbling block. Qatar, mediating on behalf of Hamas, said there is a lack of clarity from both parties at war.
We are seeing contradictory statements coming in from ministries in the Israeli cabinet. We haven't seen any statements on either side that give us a lot of confidence in the process.
Israeli leaders have vowed to continue military operations against Hamas until the group is destroyed, despite a ceasefire proposal laid out by President Joe Biden last week. In an interview, Biden appeared to agree with the allegations that Benjamin Netanyahu is prolonging the war to appease his right-wing base. But when asked Tuesday if the Israeli prime minister is playing politics, Biden said no.
I don't think so. He's trying to work out a serious problem he has.
The ceasefire plan begins with a 6-week temporary pause in fighting in exchange for some hostages held by Hamas and ultimately moves towards a permanent cessation of hostilities. As Israel's guarantor in mediation talks, the United States said it expects some bargaining from both sides, but is confident that Israel will keep its side of the deal.
We have every expectation that they'll continue to back this proposal because it is theirs, and it is in their interest. It's also in Hamas's interest. They say they want the war to end. This is a path to end that war.
As Palestinians meet daily destruction and death in Gaza, not many share the administration's optimism, including a former U.S. negotiator for the Middle East.
My prediction is that even if both sides accept this, which is far from certain given the politics, particularly in Israel, that if you're lucky, really lucky, you'll get through phase one. But I don't see much beyond that.
Biden has rallied support from the international community, including through a United Nations Security Council resolution to support the ceasefire proposal. The U.S. resolution does not include a demand for Israel to halt its operations in Rafah, part of another Security Council resolution pushed by Algeria.
Vast majority of Security Council members would like to see the Rafah operation halt now. But if the U.S. can convince other council members that their proposal is a credible path to a ceasefire, including a ceasefire in Rafah, then I do imagine that other council members will compromise.
But as civilians' casualties continue to mount, prospects for a ceasefire deal appear dim, at least for now. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
We turn now to Ukraine, a country that's been at war with invading Russian forces since February of 2022. Ukraine has made it no secret that it needs more material support from allies. Now, Turkish defence industries are stepping up to produce ammunition. Reports indicate Turkey will become a main supplier of 155mm shells to the US, which will then provide them to Ukraine. And in June, a munitions factory is set to open in Texas as part of a collaboration with a Ukrainian company. Dorian Jones has the story.
The United States' newest munitions factory uses Turkish company Repcon's state-of-the-art equipment and could ultimately account for 1/3 of shell production in the US, which analysts say is vital to meeting Ukraine's current shortages.
Turkey stepping into this is remarkable simply because Turkey has a vast ability not only to procure, manufacture, but also it's a vital sort of supply line for the US, which is also actually starting to run low based on the amounts of shells that it has supplied the Ukrainian partner.
The United States ambassador to Turkey, Jeff Flake, praised the collaboration as a sign of the growing importance of deepening ties. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's close relationship with Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin has been a source of tension between Ankara and Washington. Another Turkish company, Baykar, is building a military drone factory in Ukraine, a sign analysts say of Ankara's increasing commitment to Kyiv.
It's a little bit risky to establish a factory in Ukraine under the war conditions. Of course, establishing a factory in Ukraine has a political message, but it will not. I believe that it wouldn't change Turkey's position in this war.
Analysts say while Turkey's defense industry is increasing support for Ukraine and Western allies' efforts to supply the Ukrainian military, Ankara remains a vital trading partner with Russia, and it refuses to impose many Western sanctions.
The U.S. Treasury has, sanctioned Turkish companies for, supplying dual-use goods to the Russian military, including microchips, but weapons parts, right, that go directly into the manufacture of high-end Russian weaponry that is being used against the Ukrainians. So, Turkey's playing both sides of this on a political sort of spectrum. It really does put the U.S. in a bind, having to keep increasingly or consistently quiet about sort of Turkey sort of double dipping.
With Turkey unveiling 2 new military jets in a year, President Erdogan underlined the growing importance of the Turkish defense industry, a role that is also creating more dilemmas for Turkey as it continues to balance its relations with both the West and Russia. Dorian Jones, VOA News, Istanbul.
Voters in Mexico have spoken. Its largest elections were marred by political violence and the assassination of 37 candidates. Despite it all, Mexico made history, electing its first ever female Jewish president. VOA's Celia Mendoza reports from Mexico City.
In a landslide victory, 61-year-old Claudia Sheinbaum has been elected the first woman and first president of Jewish heritage to lead Mexico, an overwhelmingly Roman Catholic nation in which males have dominated politics during its more than 200-year history. Sheinbaum, a climate scientist and the former mayor of Mexico City, campaigned on a promise to continue the policies of Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The leftist president-elect gave a nod to all Mexican women after preliminary results showed she garnered at least 58% of the vote.
I did not arrive here alone. We have all arrived. Our heroines who gave us our homeland, with our ancestors, with our mothers, our daughters, and our granddaughters.
Her nearest competitor, Xochitl Gálvez, representing a coalition of 3 opposition parties, received 28.1% in preliminary results. Gálvez recognized Sheinbaum's win early Monday.
Me comuniqué con la doctora Claudia Sheinbaum.
I contacted Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum to acknowledge the result of the election. I told her that I saw Mexico with a lot of pain and violence, and told her that I hope she can solve the serious problems of our people.
Voters like Abril Flores reacted to the historic vote.
I think it is the best time to have a woman president. It doesn't mean that the one that is elected is going to be ready for the challenge, but I do think that it's a good time for the country to learn how to have a woman president.
Security expert Ana Maria Salazar says Sheinbaum will face many major issues.
There are many pending issues, including fentanyl trafficking and especially about the immigration issue, which has become a political issue in the United States that could even define who is the next president of the United States.
Election officials say the president-elect's ruling Morena party now also has a majority in Congress. Sheinbaum is scheduled to be sworn in for a 6-year term on October 1st. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, Mexico City.
This week marks the 35th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy demonstrations in China, which ended in bloodshed. VOA recently uncovered old recordings of its on-the-ground reporting from that day. VOA Mandarin Xiao Wu has the story, as narrated by Elizabeth Lee.
A bloody moment in time caught on tape
in Mandarin, and in English.
A 20-year-old student who was on Tiananmen Square when the troops arrived before dawn told VOA it took him nearly 2 hours to crawl out of the square to avoid getting shot. He says he passed hundreds of bodies as he went. The student says anyone who stood up or who the soldiers saw moving was shot.
That's the voice of Al Pessin, VOA's then Beijing bureau chief, reporting on the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre. VOA uncovered old tapes of broadcasts in the Harvard Yenching Library in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This year marks the 35th anniversary of the massacre. For Pessin, that day was special for a different reason.
June 4th, 1989 was the first birthday of my son.
He was shooting video of his son's birthday party in his apartment.
I have this video of all the little babies on the floor and all of the parents sitting on the chairs in the living room around the babies. And then my video looks up out the window and zooms in to the intersection on the corner of Chang'an Boulevard and the Ring Road. And there are tanks and soldiers stationed on the ramps of the overpass.
Pessin says at the time, China was a country still in the shadow of the Cultural Revolution, struggling to shed the utopian experiment of Chinese founding leader Mao Zedong. Economic reforms were starting to make strides, and political reforms, baby steps. Protest movements were sprouting up as early as 1986. Students demanded democratic elections and private newspapers. Then the reformist Hu Yaobang died of a heart attack in April 1989, triggering a wave of mourning that turned into an unprecedented pro-democracy movement across China. Pessin remembers trying to drive during one of the demonstrations leading up to the massacre.
All of a sudden, these organized groups started marching around us from behind the car and coming on both sides of the car and then reforming in front of the car. And they were carrying banners that identified each groups, and these turned out to be not students. These were workers.
Ultimately, the demonstrators were gunned down.
Students saw 4 female university students plead with soldiers not to kill them. He says one of the women clasped the leg of a soldier who responded by stabbing her with a bayonet. He saw the soldiers execute the remaining 3 with shots from their guns.
Chinese authorities have tried to erase this history. Mentioning the incident is taboo in China. Behind the information iron curtain, many Chinese today do not know what happened.
The government sends all patriotic people who want to make some small changes to prison.
But Luo Shenchun, who now lives in the U.S., says there is hope for something different for her homeland.
I believe China will get better because even someone like me, who didn't care about politics at all, is now completely involved with overthrowing the government. My husband and I are both optimistic.
Optimistic that the ideals that led to the students' deaths at Tiananmen Square will be realized, and that the journalists who reported on events that day will keep their memory alive. For Xiaoyu, Elizabeth Lee, VOA News.
Another milestone, the 80th anniversary of one of the most audacious military offensives ever undertaken. On June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, or parachuted into French territory. By the end of the day, nearly 4,500 of those men had been killed. It marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War.
All this time, of course, troops had continued to pour into France following the brilliant success of the Allied landings. Here are more Americans on their way in. Fierce fighting lay ahead of them beyond the beaches. Rommel would undoubtedly counterattack. But the first phase, the securing of a foothold in France, was an Allied victory of the first magnitude.
I saw one of the saddest things I've ever seen. The color of the water's changed. Those poor guys on the ground deserve all the credit they can get. The paratroopers, the armored forces, the ground troops. They are the ones.
I'm Jessica Jaree. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.